November 2019. A Vietnam veteran stood up in Jimmy Fallon's audience, pulled a small box from his pocket, and Jimmy Fallon's face completely changed. The show was running perfectly. Monologue landing. Audience laughing. Jimmy was 3 jokes into his opening, talking about something trending on Twitter, when he noticed the movement in row 14. An older man, maybe early 70s, gray hair, weathered face, was standing up. Slowly, carefully, like someone whose knees don't work the way they used to. He wasn't waving for attention. Wasn't shouting. Just standing. Waiting. Jimmy paused mid-sentence. "Oh, hey, we got someone standing. Sir, you okay? Need to get by?" The man shook his head. Reached into his jacket pocket. Pulled out something small, a dark box, maybe 4 inches square. Held it up. The studio lights caught it. Metal. Military looking. Jimmy's smile flickered. What is that?" The man's voice carried across the studio, rough with age and emotion. "You talked about your grandfather last week. The one who served in Korea. You said you wished you'd asked him more questions before he passed." Jimmy went very still. The audience quieted. Every camera in the studio locked onto row 14. "I was in Vietnam," the man continued. "And I need to tell you something about the men who came home." Jimmy put his note cards down on the desk. His hand wasn't quite steady. "Okay. Yeah. Tell me." The man's name was Robert Chen. 73 years old. Marine Corps, 1966 to 1969. 2 tours. Purple Heart. He'd driven 8 hours from Pennsylvania to New York City for a chance, just a chance, at a Tonight Show ticket. The audience coordinator had almost turned him away. "We're overbooked, sir. I'm really sorry." Robert had nodded, started to leave. Then turned back. "Ma'am, I'm 73. I don't know how many more chances I'll get. Can I wait? In case someone doesn't show?" Something in his voice. Something in his eyes. The coordinator had softened. "Okay. Wait over there. No promises." 3 people hadn't shown. Robert got seat 14C, middle section. Good view of the stage. He'd sat through the warm-up comedian. Through the announcements about keeping phones away and laughing enthusiastically. Through the band's opening number. He'd applauded when Jimmy came out. Laughed at the monologue. But his hand never left his jacket pocket. Never stopped touching the small box he'd carried across 3 states. Now he was standing. And Jimmy Fallon was walking toward him. Not the quick walk Jimmy did during comedy bits. A slower walk. Careful. Like approaching something fragile. "Sir, I'm going to come down there if that's okay." Robert nodded. Jimmy stepped off the stage, walked down the audience stairs. The Roots stopped playing. Questlove put down his drumsticks. The audience went completely silent. Jimmy stood in the aisle, 3 feet from Robert. "What's your name?" "Robert Chen. Marine Corps. Served 66 to 69. Jimmy's eyes were already wet. "Thank you for your service, Robert. What do you have there?" Robert held up the box. "Last week you talked about your grandfather. Joseph Fallon. Korea, 1952. You said on this show that you wish you'd recorded his stories before he died. That you'd give anything to hear his voice one more time." "I did say that." "Yeah. I've been carrying something for 52 years, Robert said, his voice breaking. "And after I heard you say that, I knew I had to bring it here." He opened the box. Inside, wrapped in faded tissue paper, was a small tape recorder. The old kind, cassette, probably from the early 70s. And next to it, 3 cassette tapes in plastic cases, labels handwritten in careful block letters. Jimmy leaned closer. "Read the labels aloud." Robert Chen. Interview 1. December 1971. Interview 2. March 1972. Interview 3. His voice trailed off. "My son recorded them," Robert said quietly. He was 12 years old. Sixth grade history project. His teacher asked the kids to interview a veteran. So Danny, my boy Danny, he sat me down at our kitchen table with his little Radio Shack tape recorder and asked me questions. Robert pulled out one of the tapes, held it carefully like it might dissolve. What was the food like? Were you scared? What did you miss most about home? Kid questions. Sweet questions. I answered them all. Tried to keep it light. Didn't tell him the hard stuff. Just what it felt like to be young and far from home. Jimmy's hand went to his mouth. The camera pushed in closer. Danny made his project. Got an A+. We put the tapes in this box and I stuck them in a drawer. Figured maybe one day when Danny was older, he'd want to hear them. Robert stopped. Took a breath. His hands were shaking now. Danny died in 1987. Car accident. He was 27 years old. The studio inhaled as one. Jimmy's eyes closed briefly. After we lost him. Robert continued, his voice steady despite the tears on his face. I couldn't listen to these tapes. Couldn't even look at them. His voice is on here too, asking the questions, laughing at my jokes. It was too much. So I put this box in my closet and I left it there for 32 years. Robert. Jimmy's voice was barely audible. But last week, I heard you talking about your grandfather. About wishing you had his voice. And I realized, I do have my son's voice. And I have my own voice from when I was young. From before the nightmares, before the pills, before I learned how to lock it all away. And maybe. He held the box toward Jimmy. Maybe someone should hear it. Maybe that's what Danny would have wanted. What Jimmy didn't know was that Robert had tried to donate these tapes to 3 different veteran museums before coming to New York. All 3 had said they didn't have the equipment to digitize cassettes that old. The Library of Congress had a 2-year wait list. Robert didn't think he had 2 years. Jimmy took the box with both hands. Looked at the tapes. Looked at Robert. When did you last hear your son's voice? 1987, the week before he died. He called to tell me he got promoted at work. Jimmy turned to face the audience, then the camera. His voice was thick. Folks, we're going to do something we've never done on this show. We're going to go backstage right now, Robert and me, and we're going to listen to these tapes. And if Robert gives us permission, we're going to share them with you. The audience erupted. Not applause exactly. Something deeper. Recognition. Witness. Jimmy looked at his producers in the wings. Made a cutting gesture across his throat. Stop the show. This is more important. Then he put his arm around Robert Chen's shoulders and walked him backstage. The Roots filled time. Played an instrumental. Questlove didn't smile. Just played. Every musician in that band understanding that something bigger than television was happening. Backstage, in Jimmy's dressing room, a production assistant found an old cassette player in a storage closet. Batteries still worked. Jimmy and Robert sat on the couch. Jimmy slid the first tape. Interview 1, December 1971, into the player. Press play. Static. Then. Okay, Dad, it's recording. So, first question. What was it like when you first got to Vietnam? A child's voice. High and uncertain. 12 years old? Trying to sound professional. Then Robert's voice. Younger. Stronger. No tremor. Well, Danny boy, first thing I remember is the heat. Like opening an oven. And the smells, diesel fuel, cooking fires, rain on hot concrete. But you know what I really remember? How green everything was. I'd never seen so many shades of green in my life. Did you have friends there? Oh sure. Had a buddy named Martinez. We called him Matty. He was from Texas, had this laugh that sounded like a car trying to start. The tape played for 43 minutes. All 3 tapes ran nearly 2 hours combined. Robert sat on that couch and listened to his dead son ask him questions about a war he'd spent 50 years trying to forget. Listened to himself answer with patience and humor and occasional sadness. Jimmy sat beside him. Didn't speak. Just listened. Held the box. When the third tape ended, Robert was crying. Jimmy was crying. The production assistant who'd found the cassette player was crying in the corner. "Can I tell you what I just heard?" Jimmy said quietly. Robert nodded. "I heard a father trying to protect his son. I heard a son trying to understand his father. And I heard love." That's what's on these tapes, Robert. Not just history. Love. Robert wiped his eyes. You think people would want to hear this? I think people need to hear this. But only if you're ready. Robert looked at the tapes. At the box. At Jimmy. Danny would have wanted people to hear his voice again. And maybe I need to remember that version of myself. The one who could still talk about it. Before I learned to be silent. They went back on stage 22 minutes after they'd left. The audience stood when they saw Robert. Not because Jimmy told them to. Just stood. Jimmy held up the box. "Ladies and gentlemen, we just listened to something extraordinary. Robert's son Danny interviewed him about Vietnam in 1971. Danny was 12. He's preserved on these tapes. His laugh. His questions. His voice." He turned to Robert. "With your permission, we'd like to digitize these tapes. Preserve them properly. And maybe share some of it, just some. So people can hear what it sounds like when a son asks his father about war, and when a father answers with love instead of horror." Robert nodded. "Yes. Please. Let people hear my Danny." The audience stayed standing. Applauding. Some crying. Jimmy didn't do the rest of his show. Didn't bring out his scheduled guests. Just talked to Robert for the next 20 minutes. About Danny. About Vietnam. About what it means to carry the voices of the dead. If this story moved you, subscribe and share it, because stories like this deserve to be remembered. The Tonight Show posted a 3-minute segment online the next day. It went viral. 15 million views in 48 hours. The Library of Congress called Robert directly. Offered to digitize the tapes for free and include them in the Veterans History Project. Robert flew back to Pennsylvania 2 days later. But before he left, Jimmy gave him something. A framed photo from that night. Robert standing in row 14, holding up the box, Jimmy walking toward him. Underneath, Jimmy had written, "Danny's voice matters. Thank you for trusting us with it. Jimmy." 3 months later, the Library of Congress released the tapes. All 3. Unedited. Robert Chen and his son Danny, talking about war and home and what it means to be brave. Robert listened to them once. Then called his daughter, Danny's younger sister, and said, "I want you to hear your brother's voice again." They listened together. And for the first time in 32 years, Robert talked about Danny without his voice breaking. Because he'd finally let someone else carry the weight with him. The small box sits in the Smithsonian now, next to the tapes. A label reads, "Donated by Robert Chen, USMC, and The Tonight Show starring Jimmy Fallon." A reminder that some voices should never be forgotten. But that's not where the story ends. 6 months after the show aired, Robert received a letter. No return address. Just a postmark from Austin, Texas. Inside was a single photograph, faded, creased, clearly carried in a wallet for decades. It showed 2 young Marines in Vietnam. One was Robert, 22 years old, grinning at the camera. The other was a man Robert hadn't seen in 51 years. Martinez. Maddie. The friend with the laugh like a car trying to start. The letter was short. "Robert, I saw you on Fallon. Heard you mention my name. I've been looking for you since 1970. Thought you died in that last firefight. Someone told me you didn't make it. I've been carrying this picture ever since, wondering. My number's below. Call me. We got a lot to catch up on. Maddie." Robert called that night. They talked for 4 hours. Two old men, crying and laughing, filling in 50 years of silence. They met in person 3 weeks later. In Washington, D.C., at the Vietnam Veterans Memorial. Stood together in front of the wall, pointing out names they both remembered. I thought I'd lost everyone, Robert told Maddie. Everyone from over there. You didn't lose me, Maddie said. I was just waiting for you to show up on late-night TV. Jimmy flew them both back to New York. Had them on the show together. Watched them tell stories, finish each other's sentences, laugh like they were 22 again. And when Robert pulled out that small box one more time, Maddie's voice was shaking. That's Danny? Your boy Danny on those tapes. That's my Danny. I'd like to hear him, if that's okay. They listened together. Two old Marines and a late-night host, sitting on a couch, listening to a 12-year-old boy ask his father what war was really like. When it ended, Maddie looked at Robert. Your son had a good voice. Kind voice. You raised him right. I tried, Robert said. Jimmy never forgot that night. Years later, when asked about his favorite moment hosting The Tonight Show, he didn't mention the A-list celebrities or the viral sketches. He mentioned Robert Chen, a man who stood up in row 14 and trusted a late-night comedian with the voice of his dead son. That's what this job is really about, Jimmy said in an interview. Not the jokes. The moments when someone trusts you with their story. When television stops being entertainment and becomes witness. Robert gave me that gift. I'll never forget it. The tapes are still at the Library of Congress. Still accessible. Still played. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, an old Marine sleeps better now. Because he finally let the voices out. His son's voice. His own young voice. The voices of men he thought he'd lost. All because he stood up in row 14 and held up a box.